So explicit memories, including semantic and episodic information, are things that we can declare, and they're stored in the hippocampus, which is that horseshoe, like a double horseshoe shaped part of the brain. And it really seems that the hippocampus is the part of the brain that is like the temporary holding space for information and memory before it gets moved to other parts of the brain for long-term storage. So we need the hippocampus for forming new memories, particularly new explicit information, things we can tell people about. With the serial position effect, we know the items at the beginning of the list are subject to the primacy effect, which is part of the serial position curve. Items at the beginning are first or primary, and you remember them best because there's nothing to interfere with them. And you always remember them best, whether it's right after you hear the list or 3 weeks later. Whereas the recency effect, which refers to items at the end of the list, only applies to immediate recall. Right? If I wait an hour and then ask you what you remember, the recency effect no longer applies because it's not recent. So items at the beginning and end of the list are remembered better right after you hear it, but if we wait an hour, then only items at the beginning are remembered best. Okay, so we learned our French first from 10 to 12. We learned our Spanish later from 3 to 5, and now you have a French test. We know that the Spanish that you learned later is going to go back and interfere with the French you learned first. That's what? Retroactive. But what instead if you have a Spanish test, but the French you learned first is coming forward and interfering with the Spanish that you learned later? What is that? Proactive. Okay, so that storage of our memory is that when you form a memory, there's actually a physical or physiological change in the connection between neurons where that memory is stored. I think this is really interesting because we like to think of the brain and body as separate and as psychological things as happening sort of separate from the physical body. But here we see when you have a psychological event and you form a memory, there's actually a physiological change in the very place where that memory is stored, so that the connections between neurons where that memory is stored become strengthened. And another word for strengthened is potentiated. To potentiate something is to increase its strength. So over time, the synapses where familiar memories are stored are physically stronger in their connections to one another because of this long-term potentiation or strengthening over time. So then it's more easy to access memories that are familiar. And so in your book, they have a couple of experiments about messing with long-term potentiation. Chemicals and shocks that prevent long-term potentiation can actually prevent learning and erase recent learning. If we give you the right kind of drug, or if we give you and there are LTP blocking drugs, long-term potentiation blocking drugs like propranolol, which is a type of beta blocker, but it interferes with your long-term potentiation. So in experiments, preventing long-term potentiation keeps new memories from consolidating into long-term memories. So the mice in the experiments might learn how to run the maze, but then if we give them the propranolol or give them shocks that prevent that strengthening of connections between neurons, they won't retain the memory over time. Victims of car accidents, rapes, and traumas who were given propranolol as opposed to a placebo were they less likely to show signs of post-traumatic stress disorder because it interfered with their long-term storage of traumatic memories. And that's pretty interesting. That was only done experimentally, but it's interesting to think what might happen with that in the future. Implicit memories include memories for skills, classically an operant conditioned behavior or operantly conditioned behaviors, and also our well-learned motor skills like how to ride a bike, how to type, how to play a musical instrument. These are implicit because they can't be declared in the same way. And they're housed in the cerebellum and the basal ganglia of the brain. The cerebellum is that flowery little brain that sits on top of the brainstem, and the basal ganglia sits just behind the prefrontal cortex or just behind the cortex in the front of your brain.